Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the first in the Maine Department of Education Social Studies Expert Webinar Series for our 2020-2021 school year. My name is Joe Schmidt. I'm the Social Studies Specialist for the Maine Department of Education. Today's session is titled Youth Voting and Why It's Important to Start in K-12. And I'm happy to welcome Abby Kiesa from the Circle Institute at Tufts University with us today. The Circle Institute at Tufts is one of the national leaders in civic research and policy regarding voting and voting trends. They definitely spend a lot of time when it comes to youth engagement as well, youth voting patterns and trends. And I have, if you've seen me present before, their current director is K. Ginsberg, who is somebody I've cited numerous times in research when it comes to both voting patterns, and then I've cited her research on the importance of debates in the classroom and how it leads to when she broke down the 2010 NAEP data in terms for that. So that was our connection in, and again, I'm happy, and we'll turn it now over to Abby Kiesa from Circle.
Good afternoon, everyone. And thank you so much, Joe, for hosting us and for allowing us to be in conversation today. So as Joe said, I'm the Director of Impact at Circle, which means that I'm thinking about how can we do research that is practical? How can we do research that is useful? And how can our research affect the settings and context that young people are in? I've been at Circle actually since 2005 and came to Circle from working with young people across the country. Thank you all for sharing your experiences, thinking back about how you learned about elections, because it's helpful to ground ourselves in reminding us how we learned, right? And that's what we're talking about today is how can we do learning that connects to engagement? So a little bit more about Circle. We're part of the Tisch College of Civic Life at Tufts University. And one of the things that we're very concerned about is how young people from marginalized communities are marginalized or disadvantaged from civic and political life. And so a good bit of our research and the work that we do focuses on how can we close these disparities in young people's opportunities and access to things like civic learning. As a result, we think of our work really as a conversation. And as you can see, these two arrows first here from research and research informing action and more inclusive systems, that's a conversation. We really think that we do better research when we're hearing what's happening on the ground and we're hearing what questions folks like yourself are asking. And we do that all in service to a stronger democracy, a more equitable democracy, more diverse youth voices in communities, and as a result, more thriving communities. So we're a little bit of a different research center in that. We use independent, rigorous research to really try to reach folks like yourself, other folks who are working on the front lines of youth civic engagement in order to understand and help improve the settings and the contexts that shape young people's civic and political engagement. So just a quick question for y'all. What would you like to get out of the next hour?
And everyone does have the ability to unmute themselves, so feel free to either use the chat box or unmute.
Well, I can start. I've used your information before. I've put some information how I've used some information how I've used your data in the past for grads. I just want to see what other people are doing with it. I was very impressed with the information. The kids found it wonderful. I actually found out about you by looking at a reference from Junior Scholastic magazine.
Cool.
2016. So if that helps you or not, I'm just looking for ideas or from you or from other people to see what they've done.
Amazing.
Okay.
This is Bo up in Aroostook County. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
I'm very curious. I'm a high school career and tech ed teacher. And I'm very curious about how many 17-year-olds in Maine voted because they knew they'd be 18 on November 3rd. So this would be very first voters. The question of the day led us to going back to our first memories of voting, and it made me curious about are kids turning out for the franchise? Is this something a 17-year-old kid just can't wait till he's 18 to vote, so he's voting knowing he'll be 18 or she on the 3rd?
That's a great question. And thank you for Karina for chiming in over the chat. And over the course of the next hour, y'all, please feel free to throw questions in the chat. I will create space for questions at the end, but also feel free to throw them in there whenever you want to. I can't actually multitask sometimes. So here's what I'm thinking about the next 45 minutes or so. So by the end of the conversation, I would love to have us considered some of the data that you can use in your conversations or to affect your approach. To also review recommendations from an alliance that we've brought together called the Teaching for Democracy Alliance on how to implement civic learning, and to draw on experiences, like Faith said, to learn from other people. And so here's what I have mapped out. So grounding and introductions, which we're doing now. I want to talk about some research. I want to talk about, some examples of what the field is doing, hear from y'all, and then try to make, some commitments for moving forward. So actually, to start, I thought we might do a poll everywhere. I hope that y'all will bear with me. Maybe you have used this before, but you can either interact with this poll everywhere by using the link that's here, or by texting. The address would be Abby Kiesa 320, or that's what you put in the message, and text it to 22333. So the first question that I'd love to chat with y'all about is, and again, this is agree or strongly disagree. This is kind of like if we were face-to-face, I would do this as like a four corners activity. So do you always vote in presidential elections? Or strongly agree to strongly disagree? Okay, so someone got it to work. Phew. Great.
I got in, Abby.
Thank you.
And now I've just revealed my vote.
Yep.
Yeah, Abby, I'm pretty stupid in all of this, so that's why I'm not getting into any of it. So this is
All
Tina.
right. No worries.
I mean, I would do it. I just can't. I just don't know how to do all this stuff. So
it's okay. It's all good.
Does everybody understand? You can either go to the website pollev.com/Abby Kiesa 320 if you type that in your browser.
Mm-hmm.
Or if you text the phone number, if you text in for a phone number, 22333, and then text
The letter.
the they have to text Abby Kiesa first.
And then they'll get a response, and then you text the letter of your answer. Yep. Thanks, Joe.
Yep. I see Bo's getting his phone.
And Bo, we have the same artist behind us. You have the Dreamer picture, and I have another Fabiana print behind me too.
Very cool.
Yeah.
The other thing that Maine, that's part of a banner that was at the National Education Association Representative Assembly when it was held in Boston.
Mm-hmm.
and I bid $200 to get that little poster.
Got
That
it.
was part of a three-part post that said we were Maine at the convention.
Hmm.
And so they auctioned it off, and a whole bunch of people signed the back.
Cool. Okay, so maybe is it easier if we just do the agree and disagree in the chat? Is that preferable? Okay, since we have a pretty small group, we can do that. So just for the sake of discussion, what would your answer be to this question? I believe students in my school/district are prepared and informed about how to influence voting and elections. And it'd be great if you could put your answer in the chat. Agree, strongly agree.
Somehow
Great.
it looks like I'm just replying to Faith. Is that true?
If you make sure that the blue bar says everyone in the
Okay.
chat, then that will send it to everyone.
Okay, so what can I do here? Maybe this.
Okay, so we have some differences, and this is really important because we're going to talk about some of the differences. Yeah, so 10 to 11-year-olds probably not totally prepared to vote, but that is something that we can work on. So the next question that I want to ask is actually this last one. I feel that I have all of the resources I need to teach about local and presidential elections and connect this teaching to my standards. Agree. Fantastic. Wonderful. Well, one of the things that we're going to do today is show you a lot of angles from which you can teach about elections and voting, and think about the different ways that you can approach it in case you want to think about it in different ways. And, like Bo said, he's a career and tech ed teacher, which is amazing. And there's a lot of ways to approach it from there. So I am going to go back to my PowerPoint because one of the things that I want to start out with is talking about why even talk about youth voting in the first place. And I'm going to focus in on a few reasons for that. So the first reason that I want to start with talking about youth voting is because young people are engaged for the most part in what we see. However, there's these myths out there that youth voting has been on the decline for decades and that young people are apathetic. I'm going to show you some data about why we don't think that that's the case. So here's a graph of presidential and midterm election turnout for young people, and this is 18 to 29-year-olds. And as you can see, there isn't a long precipitous decline that some people often say that there is. In fact, for presidential elections, the top line, it's pretty up and down. And as you can see, for the midterm election, there was a big jump between 2014 and 2018. And just to show you a little bit more about 2018, youth voter turnout among 18 to 24-year-olds actually skyrocketed in 2018 compared to the previous multiple decades. In actuality, 18 to 24-year-olds had the highest level of youth voter turnout since the 26th Amendment. So they turned out at a higher rate than boomers when they were 18 to 24 and Generation X and millennials. So something happened in 2018. And we even saw a rate of increase in every single state for which we have data. So it was a really profound election. And we've actually also seen, this is a lot of information, but the summary is we've seen that engagement continue into 2020. And this is some data from our survey of young people in the 2020, in May and June of 2020. And as you can see on the left here, we heard that young people really believe they have the power to change this country. Young people feel like they're part of a movement that will vote to express those views. And 80%, 79% of young people said that COVID-19 pandemic has helped them realize that the decisions that elected officials make affect their everyday life. And of course, we see young people taking to the streets. And we know that that type of activity is related to voting. We saw in 2018 that there was a strong likelihood that young people who were involved in gun violence prevention, either activities or supported it, were more likely to vote. And so we've seen really interesting engagement recently, but the reality is that, and we're going to point to this several times, there's actually lots of differences amongst young people, right? Even within Maine, as I'm sure that you can point out some examples of. And so we had just seen a graph of midterm turnout amongst young people, but this is midterm turnout amongst young people by college experience. And as you can see, there is a almost 20-point gap that has continued for decades. And so as we think about why talk about youth voting, what I want to transition to is because we're not reaching all young people. So while there was a jump in 2018 in youth voter turnout, that jump, happened amongst different groups of young people, but those differences still existed, those differences in access. And to us, that shows a systemic issue. So the second reason why I want to talk about why youth voting is important is because more young people need support. More young people need to see a pathway for them to connect to elections. But unfortunately here, we're also dealing with other myths. We're dealing with a myth that, young people see lots of ways to participate and just decide not to, right? And so a little bit more data to show why we don't think that this is the case. Again, this is from our poll this spring, summer. And here you see that we compare 18 to 21-year-olds and 22 to 29-year-olds, and you see that there's actually a lot of ways that young people hear about elections. Now, while some young people are hearing, over half of young people are hearing from families and from friends, it's still not all young people, right? And so we still have more of a ways to go. In addition, we're also seeing that the youngest eligible voters, and we focus on 18, 19, 20-year-olds in particular, because they're less likely to turn out than their older peers. And you can see that that's the case in the most four recent election cycles. And we also know that these youngest youth are least likely to be contacted. So even in a year, the 2018 year that I was talking about, when youth turnout engagement was really high, there were a lot of youth who we would say are undermobilized. They're not reached out to, and a whole bunch of young people who were registered to vote but didn't cast ballots. And some young people face a lot more barriers to vote, right? Young people who maybe didn't grow up in a household where people talk about voting or talk about current issues, young people who don't understand how, where, and when they can cast ballots. And so that means that there's some young people who are just systematically left out. And that's what we want to talk about a little bit more. First, we know that campaigns didn't reach as many potentially new or newly eligible young people in 2018 because we heard from young people about whether or not they were contacted by campaigns and parties. And the youngest youth were not contacted, and young people who hadn't voted before were not contacted. So if we leave this up to parties and campaigns, we're leaving some young people out. The other thing that we see is that 18 and 19-year-olds were not only less likely to be reached out to, but especially those who were still in high school were especially less likely to be reached out to. And this sort of reinforces something that we've seen election cycle to election cycle, that young people who are not on college campuses or who have no college experience are less likely to be reached out to by parties and campaigns. Now, of course, in this particular election, when we have a global pandemic, there's actually more issues, right? So in addition to the issues that we already see, that there are actually issues because everything's online, right? Not all young people know that their state has online voter registration, right? And, you know, and we're going to talk about this later, access to broadband for young people in certain states, including Maine, is an issue. And we also saw that not all young people really had or knew where to go for information about absentee and mail-in voting. And so this pandemic layers on the issues that young people have with access to information and understanding the process, especially the newest voters. So I just want to pause now and see if anyone has any initial thoughts or something that they're still wondering about before we move forward.
Well, I did have one thing, and one of your slides evoked it for me. It was one of your first slides that talked about kids being involved in demonstrations or that kind of a forum.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it was around 25%, if I'm not wrong.
And you know what? That has increased dramatically since 2016.
Okay, so let's go back to the day after Trump was inaugurated. There was a women's march in every city in the country, and it's probably the largest one DC has seen since. Do you recall that march on the 21st of January 2017?
Mm-hmm.
I was in the march with the government relations folks from MEA. We had our meeting that Saturday, and they said, listen, there's a march up in Augusta. We're going to attend it for a couple hours and then come back and finish our meeting. So we went to it, and then the car on the way over, there must have been 6 of us. It was pretty crowded. I was the only one that had ever been to a demonstration or a march.
That's interesting.
And I hadn't gone to one since 1969, October 15th, which they called Peace Day. And we had peace marches against the Vietnam War. So I thought, gee, 50 years has come and gone before any activism like this even happens again. And now all those people can say they've been in a march.
Yes, yes, millions of young people, right. And young women of color are really at the center of it, according to our data.
Yeah, that really hit me when they said it in the car. I just had never thought in terms of this is the way we used to let them know we're not happy out there.
Yeah, yeah. And that's changed. There's a lot more levers now, right? Like voting isn't the only way that people can, you know, communicate with elected officials, which is a great thing. But also voting is a particularly important part of how we make decisions. So the third reason that I want to talk about why talking about youth voting is important is because, you know, as we've seen in some of the local marches and demonstrations, young people really want change. And young people want to know that the actions that they're taking can have an impact. So I want to show you some examples and get into some Maine specific data. So this is a graph of the presidential margin of victory in 2016. And then the blue-green bar is the number of youth votes cast by 18 to 29-year-olds. And as you can see in these really important battleground states, the number of youth votes cast far exceeded the margins of victory, right? So in 2016, young people had a clear impact on these races. And we believe will do so again in 2020 as well. And just to give you a specific some more examples, we believe that young people in Maine specifically can have a particularly large impact. And part of the reason for that is what we call our Youth Electoral Significance Index. And this is a rating of, we gather together a whole bunch of statistics that we think matters to young people's participation and likelihood to affect the outcomes of elections. And we create a top 10 ranking for presidential states, for Senate races, and for House races. And what we find is that we believe that Maine is the second most second most likely state where young people are going to affect the Senate race. And this is impacted by young people's previous participation. It's impacted by how young people have, supported candidates in the past and how much or whether that differs from the overall vote in the state. It also includes the likelihood that the voting laws are what we would call facilitative and supportive. We also see that Maine shows up in House races. It's actually the Maine second is the second House race on our top 50 of the places where young people are most likely to have an impact on the congressional races this fall. So that's incredibly exciting. But we also know that there's some challenges, right? Because young people turning out doesn't happen magically, right? Young people having an impact doesn't happen in sort of a magical way. There's a lot of support behind that, support from people like yourselves. And we also know that things can dramatically differ on the county level. So we have this data tool that's at youthdata.circle.tufts.edu, and it's a database of all of various types of engagement and conditions that affect engagement that goes down to the county level. And there's tons of state information on there too. So on the county level, we saw that youth turnout in 2016 ranged from 46% to 59% in Maine, right? Which is a pretty big difference, although we've seen some bigger differences by state. And those numbers are actually above the national rate. So even though they may not look particularly high to you, they're above the national rate, which is good, right? But we can do better. So the other thing that I want to show is that the county level youth voter registration in 2016 ranged from 54% to 73%, which is a pretty big difference. And if you want to know what counties these are for, you can look it up on the data tool at youthdata.circle.tufts.edu. And actually someone from the League of Women Voters in Maine had reached out to me earlier this month about this data specifically at the county level. A couple of other examples. I've talked about the conditions that affect youth engagement because all of the things in a young person's environment and the messages that they receive can really impact whether or not they're engaged, right? And we've talked about broadband access, and broadband access is one of those things. So at the county level in Maine, and y'all probably already know this, especially if you're a teacher and you're dealing with distance learning, is that broadband access on the county level and probably the neighborhood level really differs dramatically in the state of Maine, right? And because so many levers of access have to do with broadband and being online, this means that those young people are at a different place, right? And they need to be thinking about the different levers that they have as opposed to things online. And the other thing that can really impact is the institutions that are accessible in a community, right? Young people who are on a college campus or young people who are around a college campus have access to different types of resources than young people who are not. And so when we look at a state and we look at counties, we look at these things. We look and see that there's a really big difference in between counties, right? And this can have peer-to-peer influences too if young people want to talk to their peers about politics as well. So that's a little bit that we found about Maine specifically. And I want to tie this back to why we think K-12 is so important and why we think that teachers are so important to address some of these disparities. And here again is some more data that we collected from May and June of this year. We found that young people, 18 to 29 years old, who remember being encouraged to vote in high school were more likely to feel like they know enough to vote and less likely to say that voting is a waste of time. And young people who were not encouraged to vote in high school were more likely to say that voting is a waste of time and that they don't know enough to vote. We also found in some previous research that we've done, and this is a big report called All Together Now by our Commission on Youth Voting and Civic Knowledge, that young people who remembered being taught about voting were 40% more likely to cast ballots when they turned 18. And in addition to that, young people who remembered being taught or in being encouraged to vote were more likely on all of these indicators to be engaged, right? So there's some correlations between being taught about engagement, being taught about voting, and being engaged later in life. And so at this point, I just want to pause a little bit and sort of reflect on that. Reflect on this idea of the longer term influence on, in some of the other data that you've seen. Like, what do you think, who do you think you need to convince that this work matters? And which of this data could help you in that persuasive work? Or what other data might you want to see?
I just wanted to add that, I mean, I'm from the middle school world, and we talk about the Constitution and government. Every time there's an election, we have a mock election, and, I hammer home civic responsibility and civic duty and all of that, and talk about the importance that they can literally change our country by voting. And I think I'm just surprised that maybe there isn't the same emphasis in the high school. I don't really know who at the high school, actually I know one person I could ask, but I'm not sure she teaches seniors or not. I guess I'm just really surprised. I thought there would be a really big push at the high school level around the country to engage kids in voting. I guess, I don't know, I'm just surprised.
It can really differ, right? And that's what we found. And there's some amazing examples out there, even of young people who are not yet 18, right? Being engaged in turning other people out to vote or creating issue guides for people, right? There's all sorts of ways that young people under 18 can contribute to elections, even if they can't vote. But what we're finding is that some teachers are a little bit scared to talk about politics, or their administrators aren't necessarily encouraging them to as much as is possible. And so that can be a really different environment if you're not in a state that's a battleground state and everyone's talking about the election.
Yeah, that's a good point. If I can just, probably it is that whole politics thing. I remember after Florida, after Marjorie Stoneman Douglas, the shooting there was going to be a national, kids were going to walk out and protest from school day. And my students wanted to know if they would be allowed to do that. And I said, yeah, the district has said if anybody wanted to, I can't lead it, but you are allowed. And they're like, we won't get in trouble. I'm like, no, you will not get in trouble. You have the right to protest. It's guaranteed in the Constitution. And then that day was a snow day.
Oh, wow.
So everybody was prepared. They knew this was going to happen, but then there was a snow day. And the next day, a lot of teachers didn't let the kids know that we were having it anyway. Every kid but two left my classroom, but I was in the minority because I think they just didn't want to lose teaching time or didn't want to get into it. I don't know, but it's, again, I don't know. I guess I'm just surprised.
I'd like to ask Tina a question, if I could, about the League of Women Voters and if she has any comments about theirs going into high schools.
Yes, actually, we just sent out 400 letters to all the social studies teachers. I'm hoping some of you got them, about some of the opportunities that we're offering for youth this year. Because we can't do registrations, obviously in-person registrations, we have a whole packet called Youth Votes that was sent actually we tried to get in touch with about 60 high schools and work with principals to get students registered, and the league volunteers were going to help. We got about 20 schools that got involved, but now we're really trying to see if young people will talk to their principal. The league, if the principal will print off letters going to the high school seniors who can vote, the league will pay for the postage. The league will send all the materials that you need, that the students need to get their absentee ballot and register. And in certain districts, and they're also going to have an envelope. So they mail the letter, but that goes to the kids. Then with that letter, that's a proof of residence. So kids don't have to make photocopies of their license, but that's only in certain schools. There are about 60 schools that was okayed. So I don't know all the schools, but anyway, so we have youth votes, and that's happening right now because we're trying to get it done as quickly as possible because, there's the problem with the mail. We also have something called the Youth Council, which there are opportunities to do something called Friend to Friend, which is a peer network of how to mobilize your peers, and there'll be training on that. There are also things about how to do a social media campaign, and there are also internships that are available too, and some of them are paid, but it's really, they're trying to get a council of about at least 50 kids all over the state to get involved in their high schools. And if you didn't get that email from us, I'll find out your email and I can send it to you.
Thank you, Tina.
That's
Sure.
really exciting. And one of the things that I like so much about what Tina just said is that the league is using multiple strategies, right? Going through teachers, going through young people, having young people try to, reach principals. And that's one of the things that we found consistently in our research, that we need to use many more strategies to make elections visible, accessible, and meaningful to a wider diversity of young people. And we believe that in order to do that, we actually need to shift how we think about voting, right? From this idea of mobilizing people when they turn 18 to growing voters. So starting much earlier, much exactly like Karina is doing, to start earlier in life so young people see themselves as someone who has a voice and are thinking about themselves as a voter, which is why it's so exciting to see people implementing things like pre-registration when that's a possibility and that's able to, because then people are ready to vote when they turn 18, and we won't have this difference, hopefully, if we implement this well, this difference between 18, 19, 20-year-olds and the older ones. But this means putting young people on a pathway. This means starting and making sure that young people are hearing these messages from multiple places: the League of Women Voters, their friends, their teachers, their households, right? And many other places. And that means that we need many stakeholders involved in this, including teachers, including local election administrators, including having a good school climate that really promotes young people's voices and engagement. And so as a result of that, I want to mention a couple of things that we're doing to try to bring resources to bear on that. So one of the things that we did back in 2015 is start this group called the Teaching for Democracy Alliance. And we're super proud to have the National League of Women Voters involved in it and 16 other organizations, all thinking about how do we strengthen student learning about elections and informed voting. And one of the things that here's all the organizations that are in it across the country, both history-focused organizations, civic organizations, voter reg organizations. And one of the things that we developed was a matrix for high-quality teaching about elections and voting. And we think about this as these columns are different angles that together make up high-quality teaching about elections and voting. So in order for young people to really understand and be informed voters, voter registration is necessary, and all of these other things. And some of these middle four things are not totally possible if teachers aren't supported. And so you can see things like talking about voting processes, talking about timely election information about how, when, and where to vote, but also talking about media literacy, because there's so much media and information out there, and how do you sift through all of it? And having discussions, because discussions help people learn what they think, right? And help people learn how to process information and think about things from different angles as well. And then an important angle is this experiential education angle, right? So Karina mentioned mock elections, right? Those are really exciting and fantastic ways. Lots of people have discussions in, like mock debates and things like that. And it doesn't have to be a debate format, but putting young people in a position to have agency, right? Where they're not being talked down to and they're thinking about what they think about something. So this matrix and an associated checklist are at teachingfordemocracy.org. The other thing that you'll find on this website, teachingfordemocracy.org, is resources associated with every single one of these columns, both for middle schools, for high schools, and sometimes cross-subject area. Because this content can be taught in math classes, it can be taught in English classes, it can be taught in science class, right? There's all sorts of ways to approach this. And so we're really excited to have over 150 resources at Teaching for Democracy that are ready to go lesson plans. They include games from iCivics that target these areas, and they include research justifications for why each one of these areas are critically important. Another resource that we have that I'm really excited about is a specific list of resources for digital, for distance learning. And in addition to lesson plans and resources for teachers on distance learning for teaching this work digitally, we also have a list of professional development that all of these 18 groups are doing over the course of the next several months in each one of these resource areas. So, there's tons of groups in the National Association for Media Literacy Education that are doing professional development right now. There's amazing professional development that MICVA Challenge and Street Law and Facing History and Ourselves are doing around classroom discussion. And so is the case with every other one of the areas. One of the things that I get really excited about is using the matrix to map onto your standards where you can connect to elections and voting. That's something that we do in some of our workshops as a group, is look at the different standards and think about how I can teach about elections and voting using this particular area that I know I have to cover, right? And then we don't get into the, then we can really meet teachers where they are. When they think that they don't have enough time, right? You can actually create a MICVA project soapbox speech by teaching young people research skills and teaching them public speaking skills, right? And that's a really exciting lesson plan that's on this site. The other thing that's there, and we kicked this off at the 2019 National Council for the Social Studies Conference, is what we call our Growing Voters Commitment. And this is for administrators, right? For people who are subject area specialists, for people at the state level, and for principals and other people working at the district level. And this says, I know this is important and I'm gonna do my best to support teachers and to support schools to do high quality teaching about elections and voting. And so we're convening the people who signed this for special, special conversations with the Teaching for Democracy Alliance members. And we have some administrator specific resources that I'm pretty excited about. So the final thing that I actually want to talk about is this is a screenshot of our data tool that I think is a really exciting opportunity for young people to think about solutions themselves, to do some research about their county and think about solutions. So earlier I talked about some county specific data in Maine, and you can go in here and find youth voter turnout and youth voter registration rates by county. So young people can look at, what do I think is helpful about my county? Right? What are the things that are really helping young people in my county? And what are the things that might really be challenging young people? And then create some solutions themselves. So it's sort of a mini research project. It's a way to teach data literacy. And it is a really exciting way for young people to be at the center of this whole process. And again, that's at youthdata.circle.edu. So I want to pause here because that was a lot. I hope you go see Teaching teachingfordemocracy.org, because there's a ton of lesson plans on there and a ton of way to sort of attack this in the classroom. But what are people thinking right now? What else would be helpful to see, or what's one thought that you have about how you might do this in your classroom? Or what's one next step you might want to take? Next step you want to take to research? Yes. I love it, talking about the power of young people, for sure. And there's so many more examples of that, you know, on the congressional district level, on the county level, that young people could uncover themselves, or we could help you tell the story of. Oh, cool. Yeah, there's a ton of ways to connect this to scouting, I would think.
Does anybody have any thoughts or questions for Abby?
Well, one of the things that you can absolutely do in addition to that data tool is our website, circle.tufts.edu, is probably has too much information on it, to be honest with you, but we have information going back so many election cycles. We have information about civic ed, information about voter turnout at the state and county level, and lots of things for young people to think about in terms of what might turn young people out more, right? What might be more supportive for a given community. I'm so glad that y'all are connecting, Faith and Tina. That's fantastic.
Abby, I just want to say, I mean, I'm retired too, and this has gotten me getting involved with the league, and I have a background in service learning and things like that, so this has been really fun to get back. But this, just hearing all this information, it makes me excited, and I have a whole bunch of email contacts that I have to contact, you know, social studies teachers that we sent something out to yesterday, and I got a bunch of responses, and this has made me like, hey, yeah, I'm ready to send them the information and go. And I feel like the league is sort of, this is a new part for the league of high school engagement, and
Great.
I'm psyched to be a part of this. It just feels good, and I'm thrilled with your work, so I just wanted to say that.
Well, you know, we strongly believe that high schools and middle schools are at the center of increasing, diversifying, and sustaining young people's civic engagement. And y'all's roles are absolutely critical. And we hope to just be a small part of supporting what you're doing on the front lines. And Faith, I really think that talking about issues is a great way for young people to be connecting to elections. It's also a way to not have elections solely be about parties and candidates, right? It could be about community problem solving and how do we discuss these issues. And that's one thing that we've found over and over again, is that young people are voting because of issues and the connection that they find between issues and what some candidates think about. So I think that's a great connection. Other thoughts? I went through a lot of stuff, and it was a slice of what we could have talked about.
Anybody have any thoughts for Abby? I know you get so much information in such a short time. You're like, not quite sure where to go with it. So thank you everybody for participating. I like the engagement and the questions along the way. While we still have Abby on the line, does anybody have any further questions, comments?
Or you want to talk about something that you've done around elections and voting before that you'd love for other people to learn about? I mean, Karina talked about mock elections. We've talked about using issue identification as a research tool.
Another thing that I did with my kids is, hopefully they'll have it out now because it's an election year, but Scholastic has a game that my kids love to play called the Electoral Challenge. And it went off of Scholastic, so I had to hunt and find it. But I use that every year to teach them about the Electoral College and to show why, people go to certain states, why California is so vitally important, why people say Maine doesn't matter, but why it really does. It's going to be a little tricky this year because they can't partner up due to COVID and play against each other on the same computer. But the kids got really savvy about figuring out which states, quote unquote, mattered more. But the better they got, the more they realized that Maine really did have an impact. And then I had one day where two boys were playing against each other and they each got 269 electoral votes.
Oh, wow.
So then it, led us into okay, so what happens now? Could that really happen?
Cool.
We could. That game in particular makes the Electoral College much more understandable to the kids. And even though it makes them feel like, oh gosh, Maine doesn't really matter, the more they play it, the more they realize, actually, yeah, we do matter. So it is important to vote.
That's amazing. And there's also like a bunch of other games that can teach different things. I mean, iCivics has a game called Win the White House that teaches young people about the decisions, different campaigns make along the way, and you can try to win the White House, which is really exciting.
Yeah.
Abby, is there a game you know of that is specifically geared towards the electoral college? Because I think that is the one that even confuses a lot of adults.
Well, Karina, what did you say? Electoral Challenge? Is that what it's called?
Yeah, it's called the Electoral Challenge, and I have lost my Zoom, so I hope you can hear me. Because I can't see anything. I'm actually on National Online Learning Day. I have no idea how I got that. Yeah, you'll have to do a Google search. If you put in quotes in Google Electoral Challenge Game, or maybe Electoral Challenge Game Scholastic, it should pull it up. It wasn't on the Scholastic website last year, and I haven't checked this year, but it does exist on the web. And if I could see where the heck everybody was, I would show you. I think I see where it happened. Okay, so no, I still don't see you. Anyway, so yeah, that's just what I use.
Great, thank you.
You bet.
I will give my shameless plug for iCivics and Win the White House. I think many of you have met me numerous times. I've served on the iCivics advisory board now for 6 years, I think 7 years. So I will shamelessly plug any and all of their materials. We executive command, Win the White House. Depends on really what part of our government you want to learn about. And we're focusing on elections. They've got a lot of great election resources. I did just update, I will drop it in the chat box. I did just update the election 2020 resources page that I've compiled with some stuff. So I'll make sure you guys have access to that as well, but it's on the DOE site.
Wonderful.
Nice.
Anything else for Abby while I'm looking for this resource? Before we thank her for a generous hour of her time.
And thank you for everything that you're doing. Critically important.
Thank you. Thank you for spending this time with us.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Abby. I appreciate all the support that I've received from you, from Kay, from Circle now, and hopefully continuing on into the future.
Absolutely. We're here when you need anything.